In this one-on-one, I spoke with Dr. Giles Yeo about genes, obesity, IQ, fat diets, research, and health. He has amassed over 200 publications to his name and mastered the art of getting technical without sounding boring. He currently has a book out along with his podcast that I have linked below. And after you've done watching, the answer is yes. I can finally pronounce epidemiological. Epidemiological. Enjoy.
Got it.
Okay, so hi everyone. I'm here today with Dr. Giles Yeo. He's a researcher based in Cambridge and an author of two widely popular books. He has hundreds of publications with a total of 15,000 citations to his name. 20 years of studying genes relating to obesity has landed him roles on BBC's Trust Me, I'm a Doctor, and he's currently out in Sweden promoting his new book, Why Calories Don't Count. I'm humbled to announce his presence today. Dr. Giles, how are you?
Hello, Niklaus. Oh, by the way, I'm not in Sweden anymore. I was in
Oh, you
Sweden for
left.
24 hours. Yeah, to give a talk. They nearly deported me actually, because as it turns out, Swedish border is closed to non-EU citizens. Anyway, they let me in. I gave my talk. I'm back in Cambridge.
That's all fine. And so I was thinking maybe I would start to ask you some questions unrelated to the book first,
Sure.
as just like a warm up and stuff, because I'm sure you'll be worn out from like giving so many talks and doing all the interviews that I've seen online as well. So as a
I
geneticist,
like to talk. I don't get
as a geneticist, what do you think of CRISPR?
Oh gosh. Okay, that was a left field. As a geneticist, well, okay. Now it depends what we are talking about its use for. So I use CRISPR within the lab, but we use CRISPR within the lab to actually change um, animal cells, animals, as well as human cells, not human beings. And we do this because, say, we're interested. So I study food intake. We'll get obesity. We'll get into this in a second, I'm sure. And if we say find a mutation and we want to know, well, what does this mutation do functionally? Then sometimes we do it in animals, in animal cells, or in human cells. And that is where I use CRISPR. Now, the question becomes, whether or not we should be using it on actual embryos that are going to turn into human beings.
Yeah.
Now that I think okay. So I guess the question is, leaving aside the ethics and philosophy for the moment, can it be done? It can be done, actually.
Okay.
Leaving aside that, but should it be done? And do we know any of the unintended consequences that might emerge from doing something like that? So that's I think is a nuanced answer. I use it, but not on human beings.
I see, because that was going to lead up to my next question, because I've seen that there could be like quite a lot of potential harms if you remove a certain gene that's thought to be less desired, for example. So I want to know, like, what's the predictability models in CRISPR, for example?
So I think it depends what you're trying to do. If and when CRISPR is ever used on a human being, I think the most likely first use, and I am just want to be clear, I'm not expressing whether or not I'm just talking about what it should likely be used for, will be people who have a known mutation in a gene that causes a disease. So muscular dystrophy, cystic fibrosis, and say, for example, I want to remove it from my family line forever.
Right.
Okay. Or I don't want my kids to have it, so that that is a situation in which, okay, well, we're going to go in and we're going to change this mutation back to normal in order to prevent that. That is what the most likely first use in humans is going to be. The reason it hasn't been rolled out immediately, because you think, well, I don't want muscular dystrophy. Why can't we do that? For a couple of different reasons. First of all, CRISPR sounds magical, but it isn't. It is actually quite inefficient. You have to screen hundreds of cells in order to get the correct targeted mutation. If you talk about human beings, that is hundreds of embryos. And I don't think we as society are prepared to accept that kind of use of embryos. That's the first thing. And more importantly, or as importantly, rather than more importantly, pardon me, we are still not 100% sure when we make one change in there, are we doing any other changes collaterally? And so every time we remove or change a gene at the moment, for example, within a cell, we now go through and sequence the entire genome to make sure we don't make any other changes. So those I think are the two main issues we actually have.
I see. And what are the current limitations of this technology? Do you think one day it might actually get to a point where things that they have done in the lab could be reversed? Or if, let's say, the embryo grows up to be an adult halfway, could we then edit their genes concurrently, or is that too far-fetched an idea?
No, so once again, okay, leaving aside the ethics bit behind it, it isn't too far-fetched. So what happens is the advantage of making the change embryonically, or best actually within an egg sperm type scenario, is that every cell that, if you do it successfully, every cell that then divides from there will have the mutation. Okay, now doing it as an adult is fine, but you won't then pass it on. So unless you actually do it to your sperm or your egg cells, but even then we have billions of sperm and hundreds of eggs. Okay, if you're a woman, then you will not be able to pass on any of the changes you make in CRISPR. If you make any changes the moment you are multicellular, shall we say?
Right. Okay, I understand. So being a geneticist that's lived through so many countries, cultures, Singapore, UK, San Fran, have you looked into the differences between races, phenotypes? Like, for example, why are Asians smaller in stature than Europeans? Why is the NBA and NFL so dominated by Black people?
That's an interesting that's an interesting question. So I have, just to be clear, I have spent most of my working life, I have spent my entire working life in the UK. So I've only ever been a student in Singapore as a young student, and only ever been a student, high school and college, university, in San Francisco. So all of my life as a geneticist has been done pretty much here in the UK. So then we ask the question, well, what role do genetics play in various ethnicities? Now, I happen to focus on susceptibility to disease rather than necessarily height or weight or body shape. No, body shape, leave that aside. Height, rather than necessarily height or weight because of your ethnicity. So I can speak to disease susceptibility. Okay. And then I think we can then assume that if it's true for disease susceptibility, it's going to be true for anything else. Yeah. So for example, famously, East Asian people that look like us, Chinese people, and South Asian people, Indians, Pakistanis, Bangladeshis, famously, for example, we don't have to get that large body weight wise before we get into a risk of type 2 diabetes, okay, and other conditions. Whereas if you look at white people, if you look at Polynesians, actually, like the Maori, like the New Zealand Maori, well, they can get far larger than I could get before going into the same risk of getting certain metabolic disorders. And now we are beginning to sort of understand why. Oh, genetically, maybe not, but we understand the biological principles underlying it, meaning that we, South and East Asians, have a lower capacity to store fat safely compared to white people, compared to Polynesians, for example. So definitely genes are going to play a role in susceptibility to different diseases. But let me tell you but clearly the environment we're living in makes a difference. So Chinese person in Shanghai versus Chinese person in San Francisco. And I only raised this issue because when I was an undergrad, so I was raised in part in the UK, but actually my childhood, sort of full development stage, that was done largely in Singapore. So I was raised on, Singaporean food, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
But when I was at university, this is in California, in San Francisco, Berkeley, and I remembered I had a roommate of mine who now his parents were Taiwanese. All right, so he was but he was born and raised in San Francisco in the Bay Area. Dude, The guy was like 6'2" or something. He was large. I'm looking at him going, and I look at his parents. I'm looking at his parents. His parents were not 6'2". All right. I'm looking like that, and I'm thinking to myself,
Mm.
this is therefore the environment. What kind of meat did he drink? How much milk? What was he doing differently and eating differently? So there we have a classic example of which clearly the genes which make him look Chinese, which make us look Chinese,
Yeah.
all right, are still there because he was demonstrably Chinese, but yet certain other aspects of him were just does not look like, you're not going to look at some Singaporean or a Chinese person and go, oh, that this you'd be able to tell the difference. And one of the games, this is not really a game, that I used to like to play when we could fly, by the way, when we could fly, is to sit in the airport in various places. Okay, I might be in Hong Kong, I might be here and there, is to actually look at different people. I focus on people that look like us.
Okay.
And try and predict where they're from. Okay. And then just sort of, I'm there with my coffee and I just listen to what they say. First of all, did I correctly predict they were Chinese, for example? And I says, ooh, well, this Chinese person, is it American Chinese, Hong Kong Chinese, Chinese from the mainland,
Yeah.
Taiwanese Chinese, Singaporeans? And I just try and do, and I think I've begun to pick up some hints where even though we all are Chinese, how we look is actually quite different. The differences within us can actually be quite stark,
Right.
just from a cultural and upbringing perspective.
Wow. Okay. In an article that you wrote, so I'm coming down to like more topics of interest that's relatable. And in the book Gene Eating, you mentioned that genetic testing for personalized diets are actually pretty worthless. There's not a lot of science backing it. Is the evidence more credible in allergy testing? Let's say if I want to test if I'm allergic to milk, dust, particles, stuff like that.
So it all depends. I just to let's clarify the nomenclature. Let's deal with milk. So there is milk allergy, but this tends to be allergy to the protein found in cow's milk, and this tends to occur in childhood, and not many children, is relatively rare, but it does occur in childhood, and children tend to grow out of it. Yep. What we're talking about is lactose intolerance, which is not an allergy. So this is a biochemical problem. Okay, so an allergy is something when your immune system attacks, you get a flare up of immune system. Whereas my inability to drink milk, and I'm sure yours too, in terms of lactose intolerance, is down to a biochemical deficiency. Not deficiency, it's the fact that the enzyme no longer works in us as adults. Yeah. Now that is a single gene change. So that's a single gene characteristic. So it is lactose dehydrogenase, pardon me. And so it is predictable. So when we're dealing with traits that are specific for individual genes, they are predictable, and you should be able to screen for them, and you will be able to predict. The other ones that are predictable are ability to metabolize caffeine, okay, and the ability to metabolize alcohol. Okay, so these are all predictable traits. And so if you look at those, fully predictable, we'll be able to screen people and say, you shouldn't be drinking milk, you shouldn't be drinking as much alcohol, etc., etc. But there are a lot of other things. Our ability to handle carbohydrates, our liking for protein, whether or not we can handle fat more than others, how large are we, how tall are we? These are going to be the role of hundreds and maybe thousands of genes. Now, genetic testing is, at the moment, I wouldn't say next to useless, because the genetic testing will give you risk predictions. It will give you a percentage. It will say, ooh, the chances of you becoming fat, being short, being tall, whatever, is going to be X amount. Yeah. But they're never going to be predictive. Or so not never. For the moment, they're not going to be predictive. And a large part of it is because these genetic testing companies, I'm not going to name them, I don't want to be sued, that are actually out there, they take population level risk and then try and extrapolate it to individual predictions. But the problem is these companies only ever look at your genes exclusively. So they're not lying about your genetics. It's got to be correct. But they don't ever measure, they don't ever take into any meaningful consideration your environment. Okay, so in other words, are you rich or poor? Are you living in Singapore, or are you an American Singapore Chinese, or are you Chinese, whatever? Okay, where genetically, I'm going to be exactly the same if I was raised in Singapore, raised in the States, or raised in Shantou, right?
Yeah.
But whether or not I have a risk of getting a number of different diseases will depend on where I am raised. And so these testing companies do not take this into account. So until we have a better idea of taking this into account, we're not going to be very predictive with these tests. That's the problem with the tests. They're trying to use the data for something it's not designed to do.
I see. Okay, you've also mentioned that some people metabolize fats and carbs differently from others.
Mm-hmm.
In your explanation, is that basically also why some people seem to have like a crazy metabolism and cannot get fat no matter how much nonsense they consume? Or
I don't know if someone doesn't get fat no matter how much nonsense they consume, not necessarily, but it is true. But it is undoubtedly true that for some people, they can eat more than me and not gain as much weight as me. So this is undoubtedly undoubtedly true. The reasons why, well, do you know what? Surprisingly, we haven't found that many genes to do with it. So most of the genes which we've found to be linked to BMI, to body weight, okay, have been genes that influence our feeding behavior. So in other words, in essence, how much we eat. So why haven't we found genes about what we do with the food after we eat it? Either burn it, store it. Because there is an issue, I think, with two reasons why. And why we haven't found these genes. First is what I would call measurement error. And I mean measurement error is that when I'm eating something, a slice of pizza, for example, it is a measurable piece. You can weigh it, there's a weight, you can see it. And I'm eating a weight of pizza, X grams of pizza. So it's easier to actually measure that. The problem with the other side of the equation, the metabolism, is that you really can only measure it in two different ways. First is heat, because the amount of heat we give off, that's the amount of energy we might get off, and carbon dioxide to oxygen ratio. Okay, in other words, the more carbon dioxide we're breathing out, the faster our metabolism is. And those are they're not impossible to measure, because we have calorimeters, for example, in the University of Cambridge. You can sit in a sealed room, same size as my room over here, and this can be measured, but it's not scalable. We cannot do it in hundreds of thousands of people easily. And so there's the measurement error. Okay. And the second problem is effect size. And what do I mean by this? Look, I think a chocolate bar, there are many available, typically is 240 calories or so. All right. Typically, that's the kind of like the size of chocolate bar. Now, if one is motivated, and often I am motivated, it will take me maybe less than 60 seconds to finish the chocolate bar. Okay. But it will always take me 20 to 30 minutes on a treadmill to run it off. So human beings, living creatures, to be fair, are designed evolutionarily to eat, to take on board calories. Okay, far easier it is for us to burn the calories. Why? Because that is what has kept us alive. We never had enough food. So the more efficient you were in what you could do with any given calorie you put in, the better. It has actually kept us alive. So for that reason, we have not been able to find genes that influence that side of the energy balance equation as easily as we have found for food intake. But those genes are going to be there.
Exist. Okay. So if our body is evolutionary driven to consume as much as possible, why do we then store fat really selective? Especially if you see in females, they tend to store more in the subcutaneous fat regions. And for males, it's usually like the belly. And for me, for example, it's my lower back. Is there a genetic basis for this? Is it to protect the vital organs? Why is just fat just so stipulated around those regions?
That's a very good question. And so I don't think we know for sure. I'll give you some ideas that we actually have. So that's an excellent question. And people will tell you they know that they're lying. Okay, so undoubtedly there are huge genetic effects. So we'll start with the male shape versus the female shape. Okay, broadly speaking, there's not exclusively, but you can tell that there are actually differences. So the reasons for it are largely hormonal. Okay. And we know this because females have a female shape. They tend to be more pear-shaped. Okay. Yeah. And so whereas men, as you describe, are more apple-shaped. Now, but a percentage of women, once they get into the menopause, once they pass the menopause, and so therefore their estrogen levels then plummet. Okay. What this does is this changes the ratio between testosterone, and people call it the male hormone, but females have testosterone too, just nowhere near as much as males. But when the estrogen levels suddenly plummet, you change the ratio between the testosterone and estrogen. Okay. So in other words, suddenly women become androgenized, which means that they suddenly have a more male hormonal profile. And this is why a percentage of women that go into the menopause change their body shape. They do begin to start actually putting on weight there, indicating the roles of hormones with regards to where you put the fat. So why then do men store fat around their belly? So that I don't know why. But what's the difference between fat around the belly and fat around the bum? As far as we know, this visceral fat is bad for men. Okay, this is why we die younger from metabolic diseases. Then you might wonder, well, why did evolution have it? Well, as it turns out, the fat that's actually around the belly is metabolically more responsive. And what I mean by this is that when we are in need of energy now, so say, for example, I have been running around and I got a spear and there's a saber-toothed tiger about to jump on me, and you move, that fat around the organs, the visceral organs, are released quicker as energy than the stuff around the bum.
I see.
So that's the advantage. That's why men have this. It's just the problem is we now have too much of it, and it's actually causing us trouble.
Right. The infamous 3 body types then, ectomorph, endomorph, mesomorph, they're said to be like genetic determinants of how you should eat and train. Is there any truth to this, or is it just junk science?
It's junk science. So I think there are 2 different. So your body shape is actually very, very powerfully genetically influenced, far more genetically powerfully influenced than your actual weight. Your actual weight is genetically influenced, but your body shape, whether or not you have a big bum, a big tum, are you big all over? Okay. And you can just tell this by, once again, at the airport, where clearly I spend too much time looking at people. If you actually look at families, okay, and you almost just see, and say a family, just a traditional male, female, son, daughter type scenario. And then you kind of look and says, okay, who does the daughter look like shape-wise? I kind of look her over the side of my coffee cup. And it says, does she look like mom? Does she look like dad? What shapes? And you can actually, the body shapes are tremendously genetically influenced. Okay. And your diet will have very little to do with your shape, but will influence your body size. In other words, how big you actually become. Now, in terms of the type of workout, okay, and you can go to the gym, and I'm going to go to my booty booster or whatever they call it, okay, in order to do, there is no way of targeting where you want the fat to go off from. Yeah. Where your fat will come off from, it's going to be down to your genes. And so me, for example, the last place which fat comes off for me is around my cheeks. I've got these, my wife calls them squirrel pouches, which I do. I've got a round face, but this is because this is the first place fat goes on when I gain a bit of weight, and it's the last place fat goes off when I lose weight. That is just the way it is. For some women, it's their boobs. For other women, it's their bottom. For men, sometimes it's here. There is nothing we can do to do sit-ups to get rid of the fat on our tummy. We need to lose weight as in general, and where you lose the weight from is down to your genes.
You have advocated for banning junk food advertisements on the role that the media plays in human behavior, and the studies and the studies that have supported this theory, especially when it comes to kids. What about the roles that IQ plays in human behavior when it comes to food nutrition?
IQ in food and nutrition? You mean whether or not they can actually make the right food decision choices?
Yeah.
All right, that's a complex question. To my mind, all of us that are okay. I think there are going to be certain people who are cognitively developmentally delayed, and I'm not talking about those mental retardation, developmental problems. leaving that aside, which is a condition. Okay, now we're talking about the normal distribution of people, some of whom are geniuses, other people who are not geniuses. All of us are designed to know when to eat and, broadly speaking, what to eat. Certainly 30 or 40,000 years ago on the Serengeti. Because if we didn't know those two pieces of information, we wouldn't be alive today. So every single selection pressure that has been there has been to say, okay, well, we are in this situation now. We need to make sure we find food and eat food. And these are going to be people with particularly big brains, other people who tend to be particularly the more physical, other people who are weaklings, whatever. But generally speaking, we know when to eat and what to eat. The problem is we are now in an environment in which we are not necessarily designed for, where there is too much food around, and the food that's available to us is of poorer quality, or at least it's just differently processed. Okay, and there is no evidence that IQ makes you make poorer or worse decisions when it actually comes to food. Right. That at least from the studies that are actually that are actually out there.
See, and I guess it's also quite hard to say because you got to consider other like socioeconomic factors as well that comes into play.
That's right. That's right. So how well educated you are does not is a level of information, but that doesn't mean how intelligent you are, because you could be very well educated but not as smart as someone who's not educated. But never had the opportunity to do so, but is very, very smart. So yes, those are all the confounding factors that are actually in there.
Right. And I guess having a high IQ does not mean you actually know about, the ins and outs of how food is made and stuff.
But it doesn't actually make a difference. So for example, some of the leading obesity researchers in this country, my boss included, are larger human beings. Now, and in fact, I heard him I've seen him and another colleague of mine getting, who's also a larger lady, getting criticized. Okay, so they are literally world leaders in the genetics of obesity. They go out to talks, seminars, and I've seen them getting criticized by saying that, oh, look, why should we listen to him? Look at the size of him. What does he know? Listen, I think we have biological drive to eat, and it's very difficult. If you are hungry, it's very difficult to say no matter how skinny or how large you are. Okay, we're just all set differently. And so just because you know that if I eat too much of this, I'm going to gain weight, doesn't mean you can do really much to stop it. If you are feeling hungrier and if the environment is actually there.
Right. Yeah, I guess it's a whole temptation drive. And I can see like McDonald's taking a huge advantage of this. I think they're opening up like 50 new outlets this year. They just announced last month. So I've also seen some studies regarding thermogenesis in people living in the Arctic regions, having more brown fat, which is more easily disposable than white. It seems that being in the cold allows your body to prepare itself for fat burning. However, some people I know then take this logic and drink copious amounts of cold ice water every day, thinking it will raise the core temperature. Does this make any sense in doing so?
Okay, I don't know about drinking cold water. I don't think so. It's true, though, that Inuit Eskimos, for example, have more brown fat. Just to be clear, brown fat is not actually fat. It's brown because its job is not to store fat. Its job is to burn energy. It's full of mitochondria. It burns energy. And it undoubtedly is true that Eskimos, Inuit, people in Siberia, who primarily live who used to primarily live outside, will have a lot more brown fat. And you can tell that this works, and they burn off a lot of energy because if you're on the Arctic ice sheet, what are you gonna eat? There are no vegetables to eat. You're gonna be eating oily fish, whale blubber, seal blubber. Okay, and yet they're not large. Why? Because they're actually chucking out heat in order to stay warm. So that bit is true. Now the issue is that is a holistic life. That is a whole life thing, and that is when you're actually being cooled from the outside, which is what we're designed to actually adapt to. To extrapolate this to, well, I'm going to drink ice water every day, okay, and only for whenever you need to drink water, and that's going to increase my thermogenesis. I think I You'd probably need to be drinking a lot of ice water, and if you're doing that, you're not doing something else. That's the first thing. And secondly, it's not being exposed from the outside, because what happens from the outside is your body core temperature deals with the temperature this way, rather than necessarily dealing with the temperature in there. So I think that is probably, while the kernel of truth is that undoubtedly, if you live, the problem, obviously, it's not the problem. It's not a problem. I'm very comfortable in my central heated house. Thank you very much. I like clothes. Thank you very much. Where we clearly don't have to do this thermogenesis in order to keep warm. Undoubtedly, it's true that if you have to, you will burn more energy.
Right. Okay. Moving on to the book, you've also mentioned that we have finally found a quote-unquote cure for obesity through hormonal injections, which makes you eat like 30% less, I believe. I told this to my friend, and she wants to know your answer to this $64 million question.
Talk to me.
Are there any side effects? How much do they cost? And where can she get her yearly supplies?
Okay. Let's deal with the reality. The reality is a couple of things. What I wrote about with those hormonal injections is true, and you get all of these because you're trying to replicate gut hormones. So we have 20 gut hormones in us, hormones from your gut, and 18 of them make you feel full. Okay, and so you inject them, you feel full, and you actually end up eating less. And actually, that's daily injections. The beginning, I'm just looking at the dates now. I would probably say a few months ago, near the first quarter of this month, a new drug just got released. It's called semaglutide. It's another weaponized gut hormone, and that is a game changer because it's a once weekly injection, and you inject it weekly, and you end up eating less. And people who have been on it for a year have lost 15% of their body weight. Okay, over the year. Okay, so that's the setup. Okay, for that. Okay, give me the bad news. Well, first of all, it is still an injectable, and people want to convert it into a pill, and that will be really game-changing. Second, not everyone necessarily will respond to it as well as others. But what is the side effect? So the interesting thing about gut hormones is so the moment we pop something in our mouth and we chew and we swallow and it goes out and it comes out the other side, our gut and our stomach chucks out hormones which go in the blood and tells our brains how much and what we've eaten. Okay, but it goes up relatively, you can see the curve and it does what it's supposed to do. The problem is that another role for at least some of the gut hormones is if it spikes. When a gut hormone spikes, you suddenly feel nauseous and you suddenly puke. Okay, and that's because that's the other biological role of some of these gut hormones. So imagine you've eaten something and it's poison. Okay, you've had food poisoning. And this is when we've all had food poisoning. Okay, you go in either direction, okay, so to speak. Yeah. And a large part of this bit has to do with a spike of gut hormones. So one of the largest side effects is that there is a small window, a sweet spot, in which you need to get the concentration of these gut hormones correctly, because you can't just dump it into yourself, because the moment that happens, you will lose weight. But the real reason for that is because suddenly you feel sick and puke. And people are not going to stay on something that makes them want to puke. So that probably is the largest effect. Yeah. The second thing is probably on the other side. It has to do with the other side, and it's going to be constipation. Okay. For the same reasons in which the gut hormones are there, in order to not only make you feel fuller, but to make sure that your system goes at a certain speed limit. I mean, when I eat, it needs to travel this fast in order for the body to extract the stuff. So the hormones are doing their thing. You mess about too much with the delicate balance, then you begin to mess about with the system. But that aside, as long as we know your window of response and we know you're not a super responder when it comes to the other side, then it does appear to be a very good therapeutic option.
I see. Another intervention that I've seen in bariatric patients was this laparoscopic sleeve gastrectomy. I remember in my 600-pound life, Dr. Now was saying that the long-term success rate was only 3%. Is this figure a true representation of how difficult it is for someone who is morbidly obese to get trim?
That's an interesting question. So sleeve gastrectomy, just for those of your listeners who don't know, is where in effect you remove a large part of your stomach so that your stomach then becomes the same shape as the small intestine. It becomes like a sleeve. Okay, it becomes as that, and it is effective for a lot of people, but there is weight regain. The most effective of the bariatric surgery is not that. It's something called Roux-en-Y. And Roux-en-Y is a situation where you make the stomach smaller into something like a tablespoon, 15 mils.
Wow.
Yes, that's right, 15 mils. It doesn't sound like a lot. Okay. And then you remove about 1 meter of gut immediately after the stomach and replumb the meter. But we have many meters of gut to play with. Okay. You replumb 1 meter of gut then to this bed of the stomach. Now, that weight loss surgery is particularly effective, and there is some weight regain, but actually all the studies have shown that the vast majority of human beings that go through this keep the majority of the weight off. Now, it has very little to do with the size of the stomach, because surprisingly or not surprisingly, the stomach being a balloon, the stomach pretty much gets back to able to handle pretty much, it becomes stretchy. But it's because of the hormonal release, okay, where because you've replumbed the gut, hormones are slightly different. It makes you feel fuller. So in fact, all of these drugs that have come that pretend to be gut hormones have in effect come because people began to understand how bariatric surgery functions. And so because they knew, when we do the bariatric surgery and this particular version is very, very effective, we see this gut hormone go up or this gut hormone go up. And that's when people go, well, not everyone wants to permanently replumb their guts. Can we give them the hormones instead? And that is where the idea came from using these hormones as weaponizing these hormones and using them as drugs.
Okay. In such populations, then it seems like intuitive eating is what has got them there in the first place. If possible, how would you manage such a patient if you were given the chance?
Which patient? The patient that are not responsive to bariatric surgery, or the people who get fat?
The patients who are not responsive to bariatric surgeries.
So the people who are not responsive to bariatric surgery, we have yet to know why. Okay, and a large part of that is probably because their gut hormones don't respond as robustly as for other people. And so for that, it's still going to be a hormonal issue. And so either two things, actually, no, let me start that again. The gut hormones either don't respond as robustly after the surgery, or the brain is less sensitive to gut hormones. So it depends on what the issue is. Because if your system if the gut hormones are not responsive enough, you can add gut hormones. That will solve that part of the problem. But if your brain is less responsive to the gut hormones, that's a different story. Then you have to say, well, how do I bypass this? Why is the brain less responsive? And if I can find a reason why, can I get that part of the brain to be more responsive to the gut hormones? So I think simply saying, it depends how severe it is. I mean, like all obesity, some are going to be able to be tackled using lifestyle changes, just dietary advice, a little bit of talking to. Others will require really heavy advice, others drugs, others bariatric surgery. So this is same going to be true for people who are more or less responsive to specific types of treatments. We have to understand the biological reasons why before we can actually have a targeted treatment.
Okay, right. Seems quite in-depth then. You mentioned in the book that fat diets were obviously not a solution to any of this. The keto diet is one that you cite, but I still see much debate online in the communities because I'm a personal trainer myself.
Mm-hmm.
Still a lot of controversy around fat and cholesterol. Some say that LDL does not cause coronary heart disease. I literally was cited a paper the other day. The title was something like "Saturated fat does not clog the arteries. Coronary heart disease is actually a chronic inflammation condition, the risk of which could be effectively mitigated by healthy lifestyle interventions." What are your thoughts on that?
Okay, so once again, there's going to be a nuance, and as with all these things, there is a kernel of truth. So we need to find out where the truth is and to work out if it's extrapolatable to everybody. So let's deal with this fact that LDL is not linked to LDL, and hence LDL cholesterol is not linked to heart disease. It is true for some people. Okay, undoubtedly true for some people, in which you can have, because of their genes, that they can have as much fat as they want, and it's not going to change their blood cholesterol levels.
Oh.
This is true for some people. Okay,
Right.
I know, for example, it's not true for me, and I know it's not true for the vast majority of human population whose cholesterol levels are sensitive to diet. So the problem is this: you get some you get some influencer guru person who probably is not telling a lie, who probably can eat butter and fat and cholesterol levels don't go up, and then suddenly says that, well, because I can do it, surely everyone can do it. Not true. And so that is dangerous. So that's failing to understand your individual biology and how that actually represents across the population. So the truth is, some people can do it, but most people can't. So we gotta be giving good advice. Now, in terms of keto, okay, so there are very few long-term health studies about keto for the moment. Long-term meaning over years and years and years, because it's a relatively new diet. It's an old diet because it was originally created to treat epilepsy. Okay, and untreatable epilepsy, and forcing the brain to use more ketones than sugar appears to dampen down the seizures. But for the vast majority of people who are using it for health, we don't really know. So if you want to do keto safely, at least in the short to medium term, then don't immediately think steak and saturated fat. If you're going to want to do keto in terms of the amount of fat and the amount of protein and what have you, then do consider fish, tofu, and fat-wise, do consider unsaturated fats, olive oils, and to actually do it in that fashion. And for some people, undoubtedly, keto is effective for weight loss, and for people with type 2 diabetes, it is an effective way of controlling your blood sugar. So you see, there's a nuance there, right? But it's true with the fat. But what kind of fat, what the source of protein is, because of the fat that's associated with it, makes a big difference to the safety and makes a big difference to the kind of advice you should be giving.
Right. Okay. Very nice. What about the latest trend then of taking ketone supplements? I'm not sure if you've seen it. It's all over the place online. They're said to be an energy booster, libido riser, brain grower. I'm paraphrasing, but like, are there any concrete evidence to back these claims that the influencers?
So what I'll say here is, I am not an expert enough at it. I do know of their existence, but I certainly haven't seen any convincing papers that show they're effective. Does it mean that they're not? Not sure yet. I think they probably haven't been large enough, that they had large enough studies. But I think, as with most of these things, there's always going to be one. There very often is that little bit of truth, but I think we gotta let the sinusoidal curve come back down. And I bet you what we'll see is that these things
fade out.
Either fail, and this is a possibility, or their effect size or their effectiveness is a lot smaller than originally thought.
Right. Since we are on supplements, then what are your thoughts on vitamin D, for example? I have so many WhatsApp messages from aunties and uncles telling me it's the next cure for COVID, and it's just forwarding me a lot of messages about vitamin D and telling me to ingest more of them.
So vitamin D for COVID, I have nothing intelligent to say because it's not my area of specialty. However, it is undoubtedly true. Look, you live in Newcastle at the moment. I live here in Cambridge, and we're both tropical boys. We are. Okay. we're designed for 12 hours of sunlight and 12 hours of darkness, and actual real sunlight. And so I know, for example, that in the wintertime, and I've had it measured before, that I am slightly vitamin D deficient. And that's very different. That's a different thing, because clearly I don't burn easily. I tan a lot, like a classical Southeast Asian Chinese person. And so therefore, the amount of vitamin D that I get in the wintertime is going to be far lower than my pale white friends. My wife's English, that, for example. So I don't know about COVID, so I won't mention about that. But undoubtedly, if you are deficient because of where you were brought up and where you end up living now, then do consider taking a vitamin D supplement.
All right. I've also heard your advice for girls and teenagers, women trying to conceive in a previous interview you had. Gender equality's sake, are there any supplements for gym goers or aging men that you would recommend?
For aging, not only aging men and women, I think one of the most important things is actually cardio is important, but actually the clearest marker of health, so not for living forever, but health in old age, is muscle mass beyond anything. Okay. And so what is absolutely critical as you get older, women, when you pass menopause, men probably actually you need to start thinking about it in your 50s and 60s, is to make sure you keep up with resistance training. And listen, I ain't talking necessarily about pumping iron, but move your body weight. Try to continue your press ups and get out of your chair and sit back down. And beyond anything, it is the amount of muscle mass you have as you get older, which gives you a better quality of life in aging. Now, this could involve, depending on who you are, protein supplements. So then there is a debate, right? Well, my son is 20 years old, okay? And he likes to do, I mean, he's not a bodybuilder, but he has dumbbells in his room. And one day he came to my room and says, Dad, my friend says that I need to get protein supplements. I'm going, I cook in the house. I'm going, hello, I give you a well-balanced diet, young man. What do you need protein supplements for? But then I did speak to someone who is an elite athlete. And he says that the likelihood is I am giving my son enough protein, but is he eating breakfast? So in other words, is he getting the protein at the right time of the day? And whereas a lot of us, most of us, tend to eat most of our protein at dinner. So I'm not a big breakfast eater. I need to get to work. You do what you have to do, but I exercise in the morning. So this is the interesting thing. I like to do my exercise when I first get up, then I have my cup of coffee, then I get on with my life. Then I have dinner in the evening. Whereas sometimes for some people, particularly as you get older, you want to deliver the protein at the time just after you do your exercise to maximize your actual recovery. So in that sense, a protein supplement, or maybe just having an egg or something like that immediately after does make sense. So once again, it depends what you do, what your life is. But undoubtedly, for aging men and women, muscle mass is very, very important.
Now that we know what helps our eating habits, diets, and supplements, what about nutrition timing? There's this old wives' tale that you could get fat if you eat carbs after 6 or if you eat just before bed.
So I think the English have a saying, what do you call it? Eat like a king at breakfast, like a prince at lunch, and a pauper at dinner. Chinese have a saying. Okay, the Chinese have exactly the same saying, but in Chinese. Is there any truth to it? I think there is some truth to it, though. Like most things, it's overstated. And what do I mean by this? Well, look, we are diurnal creatures, meaning that we are evolved to be awake when the sun is up and be asleep when the sun is down. As a result, our metabolism is highest when we're awake to make sure we can avoid becoming food and so we can find food. Okay. Whereas it's at its lowest when we're asleep, because why do we need to be burning things if we're sleeping? We need to conserve energy. So you can imagine if you have given an exact number of calories you're going to eat during a day, you can imagine that if you ate a lot of it at breakfast, then you have the whole day in order to burn it. Whereas if you have a lot of it at dinner, which is what we're doing at the moment, then you are about to enter the period of your lowest metabolism. Now, the problem with the overstatement is that at some point, your body's energy balance equation will kick in and will say, well, okay, I have enough energy on board. But undoubtedly, from a epidemiological perspective, it's undoubtedly true that you can eat at different times of the day and it actually will influence your metabolic status. So for example, famously, shift workers have a slight increase of chance of type 2 diabetes for this very reason, because suddenly they're awake at night, they're doing this, their metabolism is going all wonky, they're eating at times of day, and they are actually at I'm not talking what cause type 2 diabetes, but if you look from population basis, shift workers have a slightly increased chance of diabetes. So there is your nuance, where undoubtedly there is going to be some truth. And I guess the one advice that I would give is, say you have to cut some food out to lose weight. Okay, that's the only way you're going to lose weight. then perhaps I would not do it from breakfast. If anything, I would cut out your dinner calories and
Okay.
keep eating your breakfast, and that would probably be marginally more effective than if you did it the other way around.
I see.
Mm.
You've also brought up some like epidemiological
Epidemiological. I know I can barely say it.
epidemiological studies, right? And I've seen actually some criticism coming along with that, saying that there's recall bias, it's very hard to control. There's a lot of confounders that they don't actually take into account of that. For example, uh, I could think of some criticisms for the shift worker study that you've referenced, because I've also seen that, but maybe that could be because all the stores are closed, so the lack of healthy options at the time could play a role in that. So what are researchers currently doing to kind of overcome these like adversities when it comes to research?
Okay. So gold standard in terms of trying to understand if an intervention, whatever the intervention might be, exercise, drug, diet, works, is a RCT, a randomized control trial, which means that people are randomized in, you're given either A or B, and you see how it works. This works very well for drugs, because what you can do is someone's going to come in, drugs are pretty much, you can disguise them in a pill, and you can say, here you go, you take this, and only I know what you're taking, and you can ask the real question, does it actually work? This cannot ever work for diets and for lifestyle. Why? Because you cannot disguise that I'm going on a vegetarian diet or on your keto or what have you. So we know. So therefore, all of these epidemiological studies are always going to be observational. Okay, so how do you therefore take into account of that? Power. Okay, first of all, you want as best, and you will never be able to remove the problem of it being observational and not an RCT. And so what you've got to do is the cohorts that you study have got to be large. They've got to be as well characterized as you can. And crucially, you want the observations to be replicated in a number of different types of cohorts. Now, does this mean that all of the problems go away? No, because who volunteers for these cohorts? This is an important question to ask. Selection bias. And for example, UK Biobank, which is a 500,000 person study within this country, we now know, and I didn't show it, this paper is being published, is that there is a health selection bias, because the people who are slightly healthier, who are more middle class, who have the time, the wherewithal, they knew about UK Biobank, will go volunteer, right? Whereas the more unhealthy people will not. And so you need to keep all of this in mind in order to make the observations. And we are beginning to make inroads now into understanding how these work, because now we're looking at truly large cohorts, 500,000 people, big cohorts. And as more and more joined up thinking is around the world, we're now looking at different ethnicities. We're now looking, hopefully, at slightly different socioeconomic class, different parts of the world. And if they begin to show similar things, then I think you can begin to increase the confidence that the observations are going to be, at least there's going to be truth to the observations. But point taken. There is always epidemiology is rife with these pitfalls that you need to go into it with your eyes wide open. Otherwise, you're going to make the wrong type of conclusions, or try and overstate the conclusions that you actually get.
Right. Okay. And staying on the topic of research, I've seen an article that was saying about 80% of your height is determined by your genes. I'm wondering how researchers come up with such a number. Like, how did they separate the environment out? Why such a specific 60 to 80%? How was that derived?
So most of these numbers, these are called heritability, and heritability is the percentage of a given variation of a trait that's down to the genes versus the environment, have been done using twin studies. Okay, you take identical twins, 100% of genes shared, and non-identical twins, and they share 50% of genes, and you sort of work out what happens in the given traits. Now, then you might say, but wait a minute, twins are brought up in the same household, and that's true. Okay, so how did people get away from that? Well, we live in sometimes an awful world, and actually there are a large number of twins, too many, who are separated at birth and are raised in different countries by different people, thousands. Okay, and these are very, very valuable cohorts, because then suddenly what we have is we have genetically identical human beings of 50% that are raised separately, and then 25 years later meet on Oprah or something, and show up. And then you begin to look, says, okay, all right, I'm going to try to look, well, how, are they the same body shape, the same body size? And then you can then begin to look at and actually calculate the heritability. That is where those numbers come from. So height is 85%. It's actually higher than 80%. Body weight is between 40 and 70%. And those numbers have come from twin studies and adoption studies as well.
I see. And does the sample size not play a significant role in that? Because I can imagine the amount of adopted kids or children or twins separated at birth must be quite statistically low.
Thousands.
Right.
Thousands of twin pairs. So and it's enough to actually. So what then happens is once you have the discovery cohort of the number and you actually get the number and you get thousands, because obviously there are going to be millions upon millions of twins who are not separated at birth. But at least even you look at the papers, there are thousands upon thousands of twins that have been separated at birth and been recruited and actually come on. So enough to give you a range of an answer so that you're within the ballpark. Yes, you're right. I think the ultimate precision and this and that, I would probably say there's going to be plus or minus, a few things. But statistically speaking, with thousands, you are going to be able to get to a reasonable ballpark.
Last question then. What does the future hold for Dr. Yeo? Are there any future projects or key research ideas that you're working on?
Good question. So research-wise, at the moment, so the brain controls food intake, and that's what I study. As a result, actually, most of the circuitry within the brain has been worked out from mice because they're mice and we can work with mice. But mice are not humans for any number of different reasons. But so we know actually very little about the human brain when it comes to food intake control. And so at the moment, I've been funded to do using post-mortem donor brains, and begin to actually do single cell sequencing of the human feeding circuitry region in order to try and identify whether or not the same pathways and the same molecules are there. So that's a big project that's actually happening in my lab at the moment. Then in terms of what else is happening, I've got a podcast on at the moment. I've just finished the first season. Dr. Giles Yeo, Choose the Fat. So do listen. I think we talk about it's available everywhere. It's available on everywhere that you can actually find it. And I'm thinking about book number 3 at the moment. I shan't share anything because I haven't. My agent will kill me. So I'm still thinking about things. And so that's what's going on in my life.
That's fascinating, Dr. Yeo. I really hope to have another interview sometime in the future, maybe when the book's out again. And thank you for the opportunity. Please check out his book. I listened to the audio version and I finished it within 3 days, as it was like genuinely entertaining, as he has been throughout this whole interview. Thank you, Dr. Yeo.
Niklaus, it's been a pleasure.